Welcome to All Those Kings, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. We are talking about the various kings of Israel, and over the last couple of weeks we were talking about the origins of kingship. And of course the question is, why did they have kings? They had existed for 200 years, the Israelites, after the conquest, living in the highlands of Israel, simply because the lowlands were occupied primarily by Canaanites, major Canaanite cities, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Megiddo, all the way up the coast, and these were pastoral, semi-nomadic people anyway. Meanwhile, some nasty fellows came down the coast from up in the Aegean, the Philistines, and they settled on the coast, and within a generation or two, the conflict between the Philistines and the Israelites began to develop, and that's what we read about in the book of Judges. The Philistines attacked Aphek, a major battle, and that's when they captured the Ark of the Covenant, took it back to the Philistine cities, and were plagued with diseases and death and hemorrhoids, as we talked about last week. They attacked again up into the hill country, an actual invasion up into Israel at Mizpah, and it was at that point that the Israelites said, "Give us a king." They went to Samuel and said, "We want a king to lead us. We need somebody to lead us in battle." And Samuel, very grudgingly, but upon the instructions of the Lord, provided them with a king by the name of Saul. He was not widely received and well received early on, but he demonstrated his military prowess by lifting the siege being conducted by Ammonites up at a place called Yabesh in Gilead, the hill country of Gilead, and from that point on he was accepted as king. He actually was a very successful military leader, which is what they wanted, but he failed in his relationship with the Lord. We are told that he was 30 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. Those are calculated. Almost all of the dates from the time of the death of Solomon back, everything you read in your NIV, your ESV, your King James study, all the study Bibles, those dates are wrong. They're close, some of them are wildly wrong, and they're calculated dates, simply because we don't have enough historical material to allow us to peg these things together. However, there is a new date that's being applied at this point that's going to recalibrate all of the chronologies, and that is the destruction of Sodom, which is being investigated by Dr. Steve Collins at Tal el-Hammam, and many of you had an opportunity to hear him a few weeks ago here at the church. So anyway, Saul was about 30. He ruled for about 40 years and then was replaced by David. It says here that after Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side. Israel, the hill country, was surrounded by small kingdoms, petty kingdoms, some of them very tiny, some of them no bigger than Sarasota County. For example, Moab was about 10 miles wide and about 20 miles from north to south in its area where the people could actually live, raise crops, and use their herds and flocks for grazing. But it mentions here the various groups that he defeated: the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, the kings of Zobah, the Philistines, and he defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered them. And if you take a look at the map, you can see that the Philistines had established themselves along the coast. The Israelites were essentially in the hill country. Even though they had been allotted territories down to the Mediterranean, they didn't go down there and actually live there until much later, simply because there were Philistines and Canaanites down there, and those were very heavily settled areas, big cities with their surrounding small towns and so forth. But we have the kings of Zobah. That's up in what would become the region of the Arameans that we read about later on. You have directly to the east, you have the Ammonites and the Moabites, and to the south you have Edomites, and to the southwest you have Amalekites, and most importantly you have the Philistines with whom they had continual conflict for the next several generations. Now, Saul fell away from his relationship with the Lord on two major occasions that we know about. He was ordered to go and destroy the Amalekites. which they did. His army went down to the south. They defeated the Amalekites, but he had been ordered to destroy all of the Amalekites and all of their holdings. In other words, eradicate them. A terrible pagan group. But it says here that Saul and the army, meaning mostly his officers, spared Agag, who was the king of the Amalekites, and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. In other words, they destroyed almost everything, but they kept the good stuff for themselves. And this is loot. This is gathered in battle, and they distributed among themselves. And when Samuel came in and saw what they had done, he said, "Why did you not obey? Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." And then it goes on to say, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors." A curious way to describe David, I think, one of your neighbors. Actually, David was a Judahite from Bethlehem, and Saul was a Benjamite, the adjacent tribe, so he is kind of a neighbor to one who's better than you. Now, this is very early in Saul's reign. This is perhaps around 1050, 1040, something like that. Saul doesn't die until 1010, so he's going to be on the throne for another 25 or 30 years. But he has lost the favor of the Lord, and the last half of his reign is going to be one of deterioration mentally, physically, and as far as the reign of Israel. It says Samuel at that point went up and executed the king of the Amalekites. He put Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal. They're down in the Great Rift next to the Jordan River, which is the place where they crossed over to begin their conquest. They're down there, and this is still a sacred place, even hundreds of years later. It's regarded as the origin of their incursion into the Promised Land. And then it goes on to say, until the day Samuel died, he did not see Saul again. He left. Saul never saw him again. Now this is for another 20. Well, this is until until Samuel dies, and then it goes on to say the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king over Israel. So he had fallen completely out of favor. At this point, Samuel is ordered to go and anoint the boy who will become the next king. Now here's a bit of a preview. I'll talk about this a little bit later. After this event happened, it said the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul. Now, this is basically the next verse. Samuel leaves. Saul has been rejected as king, and it says that the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. There's a lot of disagreement about whether that means an active spirit that's coming down and tormenting him, or whether it's the wording might mean nothing more than the fact that he became depressed, started having psychological problems, and descended into severe melancholia. Or you can argue about that either way. But the Lord said to Samuel at that point, "Fill your horn with oil, be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." Now, he's not going to become king for another probably 20, 25 years. This is a boy. When Samuel arrived at Bethlehem, Jesse had 7 of his sons brought out, and Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these. Do you have any more sons?" And Jesse said, "Well, they're still the youngest, but he's tending the sheep." So he sent and had him brought in. And then it goes on to say he was ruddy, had a fine appearance, and that's one of the reasons, incidentally, people suggest that he was a redhead. You'll hear that from time to time. But he was ruddy, with a fine appearance and handsome features, and the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. He is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and from that day on the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. Anointing with oil was a ritual that was done by most of the people of the ancient Near East. They're not quite sure why, whether oil was considered so valuable that it was a sign, but it implied a theological relationship between the person being anointed and the deity. And in the pagan world, it was whatever deity it was. In this case, it's the Lord. And this is probably not too bad a representation. It shows a shepherd boy. David is calculated generally to be about 15 years old at this point. We don't know. He couldn't be much younger than that. He probably wasn't much older because he was still a shepherd and he was the youngest of all these sons. So middle teens is probably about right. And there you have Samuel pouring oil on the head. And it says he took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. Here's what he looks like. Oops, I'm sorry, I better cover it. I keep forgetting in church you have to do it a little bit differently. That is the iconic image of David, magnificent statue. Here's another statue that was given to Israel, I believe. This is an Italian statue that was done by Verrocchio. I think this is a copy that was given to Israel about 2000 A.D., in other words, 17 years ago, at what was proposed as their 3,000th anniversary of Jerusalem. And of course, that's a very average date, but 2000 and King David about 1000 BC and 3000, the numbers work. And I think that was given to them in celebration. Obviously, he's wearing his Bedouin shepherd's uniform there. But look at the pose and watch this picture come into focus. There's a photograph of a real shepherd boy. This is probably taken in the 30s. This is an Arab shepherd boy. I don't know where I got the picture. I colorized it a little bit just to brighten it up. But this is probably very close to what David might have looked like. A young boy out in the field with all of his flocks. And this was a task that was given to the youngest. This was a task that was given to the little boys. They had to follow the flocks around. They had to herd them to where they could find grazing. And they were out there day after day, night after night. No iPads. They couldn't read. And this would be a tremendously boring occupation, and it was given to the young boys. It says and I'm pointing out that from this point on, even though Saul would remain as king for another 15 or 20, 25 years, their lives were intertwined, and I'll be talking about those next week as well, the relationship as it deteriorated between David and Saul. Saul died, and that's when David became actual king. He started out as king over his own tribal area, Judah, and a couple of years after that, the northern tribes came down and asked him to take over their territories as well, and he became king of the territories of Saul. And I'm going back to this because this is confusing. We have a 15-year-old boy being anointed by Samuel. Saul knows nothing about it. He's been abandoned by the Lord. He's been abandoned by Samuel. Samuel has gone out and is anointing a young boy. And it tells us at this point, it's kind of a preview of what happens years later. In other words, they've stuck that in there. This passage doesn't belong in this particular spot because it's a bit confusing. It's kind of a preview. It says, the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. And when he would have these periods of depression, one of his administrators came up and said, let our Lord search for someone who can play the harp. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes upon you, and you will feel better. And then they asked if anybody knew of such an individual, and one of the servants said, a son of Jesse of Bethlehem knows how to play the harp. And this sounds like it's a continuation of the little shepherd boy. But they're describing David at that point as a brave man, a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him. In other words, this is happening after he has fought Goliath and has been brought into Saul's household. Because we see after he fought Goliath, Saul looks at this boy out there and says, who is he? So this is not something that's happening in the interim. This is something that's happening later, and it's a little bit confusing, and you just need to keep in mind that as they assemble these things, whoever the author was, sometimes they put in previews and sometimes they put in a reprise, and they kind of work back and forth, and you have to study it a bit. And it says at that point that David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. This is after the Battle of Elah. So It's a little bit confusing, but it simply is something that's put in there perhaps as a preview to show what happens as Saul descends into his depression. We then move ahead to the next major battle. There were some battles. I've passed over the one where Jonathan initiated a battle with the Philistines at Michmash. And he climbed the cliff and initiated a battle in which the Philistines were destroyed. But that's kind of an early battle that Saul did, and I wanted to get on to the Battle of Elah and the Battle of David because that's foundational to the story of David. It's foundational to the story of the Bible. David is the progenitor of the line that leads finally to Joseph, who is acknowledged in Matthew as the husband of Mary. Not the father of Jesus, but the husband of Mary. It says the Philistines gathered their forces for war and they pitched camp between Sokoh and Azekah. We know where those places are. We know where the Battle of Elah was fought. We know where the Elah Valley is. It says Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle lines to meet the Philistines. This is typically how these battles played out. One army would arrive, the other army would arrive, and then they'd spend days challenging each other, yelling insults across. This is Google Earth. Let's move on down. You can see the Dead Sea, and the Elah Valley is in the hill country leading from the Philistine coast up into the hill country, and it's a very easy way to pass from the Mediterranean plains, the coastal plains, up into the hill country. And you can see the Elah Valley laid out right there. It's almost like a highway leading from one part of the country to another. The Philistines were on one side at a place called Sokoh, and the Israelites were assembled primarily near Azekah. That's the hill that had the city of Azekah on it. And if you stand on Azekah, as in this picture, you can see the Elah Valley out there. That's where the battle unfolded, with the Philistines across the way, the Israelites on the slope just in the center of the picture there. A champion named Goliath came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. I don't believe that. The Bible is not wrong. Our interpretation of the Hebrew words and the culture is incorrect. What the Bible actually says is that he was 6 cubits and a span tall. Now, the official cubit back in those days, the Egyptian measurement, and then it was carried over into Israel, which makes sense. The Israelites had been construction workers in Egypt for a couple of hundred years using those measurements, and they took it back with them. But what we now understand to be a cubit, a formal cubit, was 18 inches. So if you have 6 cubits, that would be 9 feet tall. This is a span, thumb to forefinger. It's half a cubit. The original cubit, and we know this by looking at very ancient buildings, they actually had a measurement in some buildings inscribed on the side of a wall so that people could go over and make their measurements. And it's a line, as we would do it, and it shows the forearm to the fingertip. The cubit was originally, apparently, the distance of the foreman's arm. And then they would inscribe it on the wall, and everybody would build according. We need 10 cubits. And so you'd go over and you'd make. We have cubit rods from Egypt. 1 cubit long, 3 cubits, 5 cubits. They didn't have folding tape measures, but if you wanted a 10-cubit measurement, they had a 10-cubit pole. You'd lay it down on the ground, and you'd add another. So we know what a cubit was, the formal cubit. The problem is there was also a royal cubit. Now, that's what the king got. If he ordered a cubit of timber, he didn't get 18 inches. He got 21. And as I say in there, it's good to be king. You know, you get a little bonus. You get a little extra. Another problem is there was a Babylonian cubit that was only 15 inches. So a 15-inch cubit would give a man who's over 7 feet tall. A span, incidentally, was half a cubit, and if you look at it, it's about half your forearm. So a cubit and a span. And I see people sitting there checking their arms already. But there was also a field cubit. People might measure something in the field using their own arms. They did that with horses back in the 20s and 30s and 40s in this country. Somebody would sell a horse that's so many hands high, If you had small hands, it was a taller horse than if you had big hands. And so you'd get an approximate measurement, and then people would come and buy it, and they'd decide whether the horse was what they really wanted, but they would get a rough idea. And if somebody had taken a field measurement of a beheaded Goliath lying on the ground, they might have come up with a different idea of what the cubit was. So I would argue, well, let me show you a picture here. This is the biggest man on record, the Guinness Book of Records. This is a young fella. He only lived to be 22. The human body, the heart apparently can't handle somebody that size. But he was almost 9 feet tall back in the first half of the 20th century. So that is a 9-foot tall person. I would argue that Goliath was probably 7.5 feet tall. We have huge numbers of people in the world today that are that big, all the professional basketball players. And if you saw him walking down the street, how would you describe him? He's a giant of a man. We have Chinese basketball players who are well over 7 feet tall. So this is not something particularly unusual, and it would not be unusual for somebody to be that big against Israelites who are 5.5 feet tall. And they see that giant of a man up there, and he would be absolutely terrifying. He's described in the Bible as having a bronze helmet, a coat of scale armor of bronze, bronze greaves, a bronze javelin, a spear. He has a sword. That's not mentioned in this passage, but David later draws his sword, and he had a shield bearer, so he had a shield as well. This is a man who is arrayed like a champion in those days. He would be arrayed like a warrior, completely covered, and what he has done as he has come out and challenged the Israelites mano a mano. He is asking for someone to come and fight him. This is the way the Aegean people, and the Philistines are Aegean, they're descendants of the Iliad and the Odyssey people. And there are several examples in the Bible of their behavior which is typical of those kinds of people, and this is one of those. Come on out, we'll fight man to man, and the winner takes all. We don't have to expend our armies and our material. We don't have to kill a lot of people. Let's just have 2 people come out, and they would send their very best warrior out. This huge, strong, well-trained, competent Goliath, on the assumption that he could defeat anybody that the Israelites would send out. And of course, this is one of the questions. One of the remarkable aspects of this story is that Saul acceded to the request by a shepherd boy that he go out and represent the Israelites. I mean, think about it. They don't have any warriors that are willing to go out, but a shepherd boy, Saul was willing to bet the kingdom. So he obviously was being moved in some fashion by action from the Lord, because he's letting an untested shepherd boy go out and meet the best warrior that the Philistines can muster. Goliath stood there and shouted, "Choose a man and let us fight each other. If he's able to kill me, we will become your subjects, but if I kill him, you'll become our subjects and serve us. Winner take all." And for 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and evening, took his stand, and uttered his challenges. Now, I would argue that it's probably not 40 days, meaning 39 plus 1. I've talked about that. It means for a long time he came out, for maybe weeks. Could have been 40 days, and I would have no argument with that. But 40 is often used as a symbolic number that seems to represent a generation or several weeks or a period of time sufficient to accomplish whatever it is that we're trying to have accomplished. So he stood out there day after day saying, "Come on, let's fight." David said to Saul, now, let's go back a bit. David, as a shepherd boy, had gone down to provide food for his brothers who were in the army down there. And they've been sitting down there week after week. And David said, "How come nobody's going out and fighting this guy?" And so he went up to Saul and said, "Your servant," meaning I, "will go and fight him." And Saul said, "You're only a boy." And he's been a fighting man from his youth. He's been trained as a fighting man. So he doesn't know David at this point. And David said, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came, your servant killed both the lion and the bear." Now, what he's pointing out is that as a shepherd, his responsibility is to defend his flocks, and he does that with a sling. There were various military weapons in those days. There were bows and spears and swords, for example, that belonged to military men, but the sling was also a military weapon that could be made by anybody. And the shepherds would use those, and they would drive away predators. Became very adept at them. I mean, they're out there week after week with nothing to do, so they throw sling stones at birds and each other probably, and you know how boys are. They kind of play around, and he had become an adept with the sling. I saw a video, and I haven't been able to find it. This was a long time ago, and it was black and white, so it was probably made in the 40s or 50s, that shows an Arab boy. They're videotaping him, they're recording him with a sling, and he threw a sling stone at a bird that was passing overhead and hit the bird. I mean, they could be quite accurate at fairly good distances with this sling. And so David goes on and says, I've been fighting lions and bears. He said, this uncircumcised Philistine, and I will be talking about circumcision next week, so come prepared for some indelicate discussions, but this is foundational to the relationship between the Israelites and God, so I want to talk a bit about it. But he says this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, like the lion or the bear, because he has defied the armies of the living God. And so Saul said, well, here's my armor. He couldn't put the armor on. Saul acceded to his wish. This is, like I said, this is an amazing thing, that winner take all was given to a what is generally calculated to be a 15-year-old shepherd boy with a sling. It says he chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine, who's standing there in the middle of the valley. The Philistine looked David over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. He's insulted. He's a champion of the Philistine army, and they're sending out a shepherd boy. It's a disgrace. He's embarrassed. He's being humiliated. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? You send this boy out here against me? And David said, I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. And then he makes a huge challenge. He said, this day the Lord will hand you over to me. I'll strike you down, cut off your head, and the whole world will know there's a God in Israel. David, reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. David took hold of the Philistine's sword, drew it from the scabbard. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. Now, incidentally, cutting off the head with a sword probably took several hacks. It was a very difficult thing to remove a head, which is why all of the various wives of the English kings requested French executioners to come over, because those guys were particularly good. You had to have a very sharp sword. You had to know how to do it, and the problem is the neck is full of bones, and if you hit a bone, there are examples of people being chopped at 3 and 4 and 5 times before the head's removed, and the Philistine sword was big and heavy, so this was a fairly graphic incident where David went up and with the sword killed him, probably stabbed him, and then hacked away until he could pick up his head. And it said when the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran, and the men of Israel finally got their courage, surged forward with a shout, pursued the Philistines, and it turned into a rout, with most of the Philistines being killed, probably being cut down from behind. They're running down the hill, the Israelites are behind them, and many battles ended up that way. Once the rout started, more men died running away, being attacked from behind, than in face-to-face combat. Now, here's a sling. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about it because the consensus, certainly in the secular world, is that this story never happened. It's a fiction. It couldn't have happened. A shepherd boy with a sling could never have defeated this. The story was made up simply to make the Israelites feel more important. I'm arguing that this is the only way that that Philistine could have been defeated. And I'll show you why. This is a sling. It's simply a pouch about the size of my hand, and you'd put a stone in it, and you have two two cords, and you would swing it in a circle and then let go of one of the cords. It would open up and the stone would fly out. Now, it's going at 140, 150 miles an hour, and the average sling stone is about the size of a baseball in those days, a hard ball. These are big stones. Now, they could use smaller ones, and as you get into the time of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they made their sling projectiles out of metal, and they actually shaped them like projectiles, and they would engrave them with their own names, or they would... They improved, and there was an evolution in the technology, but this is the basic sling that you see right there, and here's how it was thrown, and it could be thrown the length of a football field or further. Here is an Assyrian relief. Now, this is several hundred years later. This is in the 700s BC. This is a relief about the siege of Lachish. But notice there is actually a platoon of slingers behind the archers there. You can see them with their slings, and in the slings are their stones. And look what's in their other hand, more sling stones. And they would use these sling stones to provide covering fire to people attacking the walls. It would force the archers on the walls to duck down as these stones are flying up. And then, of course, you could run forward, pick up another stone. It was a reusable ammunition. And there is something in the Bible that talks about 700 left-handed slingers, which is, I think, I'm left-handed. Now, the reason that this would be particularly useful is that many of the cities were designed, they'd be on a hill, and you would walk up the ramparts to the gates and then turn into the gates, but you would walk up the road with the city on your right. And if you were attacking and you're a right-hander with a sword and you've got your shield in your left hand, you're exposed. And so they would have slingers who would try to protect you as you went running up to get to the gate. But what if you're left-handed? You have your shield in your right hand. And these men were particularly useful perhaps for besieging a city. So anyway, these are the slingers. And here is a real sling stone. Now, I think this is a reasonable representation of the proportions between Goliath and David. You see this young shepherd boy and a very, very big warrior. And in this picture, he is arrayed exactly as described in the text. He has a helmet of some sort. He has a shield. He has his armor. He has a greaves. This is an Aegean invention. The original shields for most armies went from shoulder to ground, but those are very unwieldy. So when they made the shields a little smaller for mobility, it exposes your lower legs, and so they made those greaves, which are perhaps like soccer shin guards, keep you from getting cut on your legs. He had a spear. Now, that's not a throwing spear. It's a great big pole with a bronze point that you jab with. He had a sword. It's still in the scabbard in this picture, which is the way it was described. But David has a sling. Now, if you look at the weapons of Goliath, all of his weapons are handheld, and the range of his ability to engage with an opponent is however far he could reach with whatever he had in his hand, maybe 4 or 5 feet in a circle. A sling can be thrown from 10, 15, 20, 50 feet away with great accuracy. So David would just have to stand back a little bit while Goliath is making fun of him, put a stone in his sling, throw it at the one place that is exposed on Goliath, which is right in his face. And this would stun him if it didn't kill him. As it turns out, it did only stun him. Many of us in this room can remember a story about Herb Score, a baseball player. That's basically what happened to Goliath. For those of you who don't know the story of Herb Score, he was a pitcher that got hit in the face with a batted ball, almost killed him, blinded him in one eye. Very believable story. Cleveland Indians? Now, we got a real baseball fan over here. That's right. So here is a picture, and this became, he then went over, killed Goliath, chopped the head off, and this became a feature of Christian art. Here's David with Goliath. This picture is from the Cincinnati Art Museum, where my wife Zoe was a docent for 20 years, and she would take the children through and ask them, do you know what this story might be? And one little fellow raised his hand and said, yeah, I know. He said, that's Jack and the Beanstalk. But you can see the head of David there with a stone embedded in his forehead. This is probably not too inaccurate. It says he took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. And that again, I love this picture. This is David and Jonathan. And I love this picture because look at the expression on Goliath's face. Obviously, he was not amused when all of this took place. I want to make 2 points about this. Number one, Jonathan at this point is not contemporary with David. When Jonathan attacked the Philistines, that was very early in the reign of Saul. Jonathan at this point is probably 20 or 25 years older than David. These are not two boys together. This is mentor-mentee, and you see this a lot in the military. The older officers see a young officer with a lot of promise, and they kind of takes him under his wing and make sure he gets the proper promotions and so forth. So that's basically what David and Jonathan was. But the fact that he took the head back to Jerusalem has been interpreted, and that it was buried there. And the general consensus is that it was buried on a hill just outside the city, which is called Golgotha, the hill of the skull. And so it's quite possible that Christ was crucified over the head of Goliath, who had been dispatched by David. So kind of a fun story. We don't know that, but anyway, that might be where the title Golgotha comes from. Now, this is where I'm suggesting that previous passage is in the wrong place. It said, as Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said, whose son is that young man? Find out. And as soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with David still holding the Philistine's head. He walks in to meet the king, and he has Goliath in his hand. And Saul said, whose son are you, young man? And David said, I'm the son of your servant, Jesse of Bethlehem. And then we are told that after David had finished talking with Saul, he's met Jonathan at this point. Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself, and their intense friendship began at that point. Now, the traditional dates for all this, I'm going to build an entire chart, so I'm throwing a couple out here. It's generally accepted around 1052 BC. He was anointed. The Battle of Elah Valley is generally dated to 1025 BC, and if David was about 15 years old at the time, that means he was born maybe about 1040. And Saul had as a military leader, he had the practice, which is very smart, of bringing to him men of great capability. And he recognized that in David. And it says, from that day, Saul kept David with him, didn't let him return to his father's house, brought him into the household of the king, and began to use him as a military leader and train him. And that's when he begins having his depression, and somebody says, you've got this guy here, David, he plays the harp, and you fit the story in at that point. So next week, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about the death of Saul. We're going to talk about David the king, his conquest of Jerusalem, and his assumption of the throne. And I think we're going to quit with that. I do have just a couple of minutes. I'm sorry I ran a bit long, but if anybody has any questions or comments.
Said that David had 5 smooth stones, but these look like little miniature cannonballs.
Oh, these are not little miniature cannonballs. Those are real, but you could also sling a regular stone. They would not have. Those are found. They have a flint center, and then the stone around the outside, and they're kind of shaped and made into weapons. But a shepherd boy out in the field, he'd pick something. Well, it's like skipping a stone on water. You have to pick one that's the right shape. So he would go and he'd pick one that was nice and smooth and round so that it would fly straight.
And I also heard that Goliath had like a leather band with a hole in the middle. And that was where that smooth stone went and caught him in this vulnerable place.
For those of you that didn't hear, she's heard that there was a leather band as part of the uniform for Goliath that had a hole in it, and that's where he got struck. I'm not familiar with that. He got struck in the face, and even with a leather strap there, I don't think it would have afforded him much protection. But the question was, how big are the armies? I'll have to talk about this a little bit later. The numbers in Genesis, from the Exodus all the way through Judges, those numbers are wrong. They're absolutely unbelievable numbers, and they are based upon a misinterpretation of the Hebrew that describes the numbers. For example, 2.5 million Israelites leaving Egypt is not a believable number. It says 600,000 men plus women and children and others. That adds up to 2.5 million. If you calculate out the women for the 600,000 men, the Bible says there were 600 Eleph. And if this is an old story, the word Eleph, way back when, had a whole lot of other meanings. By the time of David, Eleph only meant 1,000. And so traditional interpretations interpret that as 1,000, but way back when it had meanings like squad. And so you could argue that the Israelites left with 600 squads of men. So we're talking about a few thousand men, not 600,000. And I don't have time to go into that, but that is one of the huge stumbling blocks for the secular world, is that all those stories talk about armies of 90 and 100 and 200,000 men. There's no room for armies that big in that part of the country. The valleys are too small, the roads are too small, they don't have water, they don't have grazing. These are much smaller numbers, and Canaanite armies and Philistine armies, I would argue, were in the 2,000 and 3,000 range. Anyway, those numbers, we'll have to talk about it sometime, but unfortunately, all those other meanings went out of usage. It's kind of like our word gay. 50 years ago, gay meant one thing. 20 years ago, it had two meanings. Now it only has one. Hebrew words do the same thing, and I think there are some good studies that have shown that that's just not feasible. Next week, we'll talk about David. Thank you.
Bible Interact, uncovering the mysteries of the kingdom of God. At BibleInteract.tv, you will penetrate the scriptures of the Bible. At our store, you're just one click away from owning your favorite books, DVDs, or study guides. Earn a degree from our university and watch hundreds of video presentations from biblical scholars, archaeologists, and theologians. By subscribing to Bible Interact, you'll find all the resources you'll need, so why not subscribe today? Go to www.BibleInteract.tv. You'll be glad you did. Interested in studying more about the temple, the Messiah, or what God's plan is for our future? No problem. We've got you covered. With more than 200 DVDs, books, and workbooks, you'll find the answers you've been searching for. Bible Interact, uncovering the mysteries of the kingdom of God.